You don't see the slides? Give it a second. All right, go ahead and switch down to the next one scene. Cool. And the audio's coming in okay? All right. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and get things going then. The talk you're about to see is called Of History and Hashes, Brief History of Password Storage, Transmission, and Cracking. My name is Adrian Crenshaw. I run IronGeek.com. I have an interest in InfoSec education. I don't know everything. I'm just a geek with time on his hands. So if I get something wrong, let me know. And I'm also a senior information security consultant at TrustedSec, Dave's company. And I'm also a co-founder of DerbyCon. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's IronGeek_ADC. Now, if,
Be careful of his Twitter feed.
a lot of Unicode. Anyway, a few thank yous. One is to Password Security, a case history. I pulled a lot of information from that, and it was actually the inspiration for this talk. And also, Password Security, Past, Present, and Future by Solo Designer and Simon Marshall. I don't know how to pronounce his name. If that talk had been recorded, a lot of my talk really wouldn't be needed. They focused more on, I believe, Unix passwords, though, and I'm focusing more on, well, a lot more stuff involving Windows and little sideline things about password storage. But a little bit first about password history. Reinvent the Wheel. The things I want you to take away from this particular talk. One thing people say is that InfoSec's always changing. You always have to keep up, and that is a degree of truth to that. New exploits come out. New attack techniques come out. When you look at the core of things, there's some things that just don't change. Some mistakes are made again and again. The thing I like to say is, software vulnerabilities generally get patched, but bad design decisions and reoccurring configuration mistakes are forever. For instance, MS-08067 is hopefully will be patched on most systems by now. There's exceptions, but that eventually gets patched. However, if someone's choosing a silly password like password123 and someone having bad password policies, that's going to be around forever. People right-clicking and saying, well, we'll share this drive out to everyone with read-write rights, because that's the easiest thing to do, rather than figure out what permissions to give individual people. That's going to keep happening forever. So you see a lot of mistakes that happen over and over again. A little bit of research, though, before actually designing something might increase security. Things that have happened before, problems that have happened before, are likely to happen again. And if you realize something from history that this has happened before, you might know to fix it before it becomes a problem for you. So, a little bit about password history. In ancient times, centuries would be using things called watchwords. So you know whether or not someone was of your particular tribe, your particular army. You would challenge them, they had the right watchword, and then you know to let them pass. This is written up by Polybius in one of his books. He lived approximately 200 to 118 BC. And this particular Greek wrote out exactly how the military would exchange the watchwords at the beginning of each day and get them transferred from one division to the next division to the next division. Also, you can look at things like references in the Bible that aren't quite watchwords, but are similar. The Israelites were having a particular issue with a different tribe, and depending on how this other tribe pronounced the word shibboleth, they would know whether or not they were of that tribe. And if you couldn't pronounce it right, or if you had a speech impediment, it would be a really, really bad day to be an Ephraimite. I'm maybe mispronouncing those hugely. Some of the better biblical scholars than me can actually say them. But, they used it as a challenge word to see whether or not they were of a particular group based on whether or not they could pronounce it correctly. Other uses, though, of passwords in olden times would be like the Veneer cipher. The Veneer cipher was sort of like the Caesar cipher, but it was variable. It was a polyalphabetic substitution. Instead of always incrementing by 13, you would increment by a passphrase. Like, I'm not sure if they all worked exactly this way, but let's say you had password of Adrian. You might increment by 1 each letter in the alphabet of whatever word you're encrypting. And let's say the D, well, you're going to increment by 4, and so on and so forth. So something like that would happen, and you do the exact opposite to undo the Veneer cipher. Now, this was first invented way back in the day by Giovanni Battista Belso in 1553, but other people have invented basically the exact same algorithm. It's called Veneer because I guess his write-up of the implementation was the most common, or the most well-known. And this was used during the Civil War. Most times when people were doing a Veneer cipher, you'd have a table you'd go through for figuring it out. They had the CSA cipher disk for quickly computing, okay, what is the letter that I need to translate this to? A little later, you'd also see people use passphrases or fast words at bars. You ever seen the Marx Brothers film Horse Feathers? They use the password swordfish to, know whether or not someone is of the in crowd and then let them into that particular speakeasy. Also, they use that same name, Swordfish. That's the reason why that early 2000s movie, that's a documentary, was so real to life. That's where it got its name from, was from horse feathers. There was also, of course, military use. Besides normal, like, watchwords and so forth, there was other types of challenge response systems the military would use. For instance, the US 100 and 1st Airborne Division, during the Battle of Normandy, used the password flash, to which the challenge would the challenge person would respond with the counter password thunder to know whether or not they were actually that person. There was also something issued called the cricket on D-Day, and when a person made a certain sound with it, like one click, the other person would do 2 clicks, so they would know that, oh, that's a friend and not a foe. But, that brings me up to computer systems. So passwords, basically, that was I'd allude was to say that, the idea of passwords and challenge response systems and all that had been around for millennia, but the first computers that were around didn't actually have passwords. When you're in let's say, a military facility, and only people who can get to that machine have to go through several armed guards, and there's no network connections, physical security was the only security. Especially if only like one program was running on the system at a time, you didn't really see passwords come in until shared systems came around. MIT's compatible timeshare system, CTSS, is part of the first use of passwords on computer systems. Earliest one I could find out there on the internet, at least. And by the way, when researching this thing, I may get some things wrong because finding documentation on some of these older systems is difficult. Like, for instance, the things you assume about a computer that aren't necessarily true. Like, I assumed that these people had some kind of TV-like terminal hooked to these systems, but apparently it was actually most likely teletype, but nothing in the descriptions, vividly said that. They just said something, well, I'll allude to it more in when I talk about one of the things that went screwy with this particular system. Now, the CTSS, it had passwords, but they were in plain text. They weren't stored as a hash or encrypted in any way. But this was mostly okay because it was in a spot where hopefully only the system and the administrators of the system could get to it. This is still, though, obviously, has a problem with disclosure. Let's say you have like some kind of backup. Someone might be able to get it off the backup. Also, accountability problems because one admin could steal another admin's password, and you wouldn't really want that. But there was other problems with this. Remember I said the passwords were in plain text? So, in 1962, Alan Shearer, he entered a punch card and had the entire password file the entire password file printed out for him. Because he was upset that he didn't have enough shared time on the system. So his solution, make out this punch card, and apparently whatever I was reading the punch cards must have had what would be the equivalent of system-level privileges today. So it was able to actually, even though he himself would not have the rights to get it, request that that particular file gets printed. And then he had everybody's passwords. This is part of the first instance of someone stealing passwords in history. Let me see, what was I? But it kind of reminds me of people running things with too much privilege. Like, for instance, someone running a web server as root, or all the different things that are run as system, and if you can happen to get the system to do something for you, and get to do more than it's expected, it's basically a historical event that should have shown a lot of people that running things with least privilege would have been a far better call. But because of how that was ran, he could print out the entire password list. Also, another interesting thing about how they did this, remember again, passwords were in plain text. So in 1966, 2 users were editing the quote of the day and the password file at the same time. And the problem with that is the quote of the day, as soon as someone logs in, it starts printing out that quote of the day. So all of a sudden, all these people started seeing this on their teletype terminals, because the way the text editor for that system worked is it made a temporary file, and somehow that temporary file became the password file when it's supposed to be the day file. And so a ton of people got passwords streaming onto their terminals. My understanding it happened on like 5 o'clock on a Friday, and they tried to quickly shut down all the machines and get it reset, and the guy just had a really bad weekend. Systems like the previous one I mentioned from MIT led to Multics and Unix. Now, Multics used a person name table for password storage. It had an 8-character password limit, which we know today is far too little, but maybe that was the origin of how so many people still have, for some systems, an 8-character password limit. But you did apparently have the option to encode the password. When they were designing Multics, according to Tom Van Veck, Joe Weisenball told him he suggested basically store the square of the password, but I knew that the password could people could take square roots, so I squared each password and it and masked it to store some bits. I'm not actually sure of the complete algorithm. This was eventually replaced with the PL, I believe that's I language, had something called the scramble function. Was that PL1? Okay, PL1 had a scramble function, which its algorithm I've yet to be able to actually find, and you could use that to scramble the password in a little bit more secure way. No idea how it worked, but apparently it proved fairly weak because they had an Air Force Tiger team try to attack Multics, and they were able to successfully crack a bunch of passwords. This eventually led on to Unix, and the earliest Unix systems, to my understanding, the passwords were still in clear text in the file. So if you had access to the system, you'd most likely be able to see them. Robert Morse developed crypt based on M209 machine. Some people say the Enigma cipher machine, but my understanding is the Enigma cipher machine is a false statement. Some people have said that, but apparently it was actually the M209 that the algorithm was based on, and that appeared in Unix version 3. But I believe that one was just to encrypt files and such. See, crypt is used kind of confusingly, depending on how you're referring to it, as either the function to encrypt the passwords or as basically a general encryption utility for files and such. Now, as far as crypt being used for passwords, that didn't really come about until the 6th edition of Unix in 1974. And the password files, the hashes, were still viewable by everybody until shadow files became common, which we'll talk a little bit more later, but I think they were first in the concept of shadow files. I have it in a slide later, I believe. It was like late 80s, but people didn't use shadow files, real commonly until much, much later. I think I didn't really see it super common until the late 90s. Would you say that's about right for some of you all? Mid-90s, you think? Uh-huh. See, that's why I need more old people around, because there's some things you just don't, no one thought to write it down, exactly how this particular system worked. Like, I'm trying to think, and this isn't even that old, I'm trying to find out exactly how OS2 passwords were stored. And I can't find a whole lot of details on that. It's something I'd like to expand. But I have an article on all this out on TrustedSec's website, which is probably more detailed than will be in this talk, because I can only remember so much, but I can put a lot in the text article. And I want to keep updating that over time. So, I think I got the link later on in one of the slides. Go out and check that out. If you have anything you think I should add, especially anything involving, let's say, OS2, or anything I got wrong with like back systems or other mainframe systems, let me know. Maybe. OS2? Okay. Talk to me later. Utility referred to as, by the way, the utility referred to as crypt1, that's one for encrypting files, and when you see something referred to as crypt3, that's the hash function. Now, this is the way early crypt3 worked. It used the 56-bit DES key. Since DES was, at the time at least, hard to reverse, and it was slow. The first 8 characters were password, 7 bits each, essentially, because remember ASCII, technically, unless you're talking about extended ASCII, ASCII is just 7 bits. You can see the rest of it as like a 0, but unless you're talking about extended ASCII. So you got 7 bits each. So with 12-bit salt, it is used as a DES key to encrypt an all bits 0 block 25 times. The 25 times is essentially to slow things down for someone trying to attack the system. One of the ideas behind this is if it takes an extra second for someone to log into the workstation, not such a big deal. If it takes an extra second for someone to try to crack the password, that would be a big deal. Though in this case, we're not talking about actually increasing it by a second, because that probably would be a little screwy if you had a whole bunch of people sharing the same system. The results were then base64 encoded for storage along with the salt. And I'll talk more about why the salt's important in a bit. Crypt-free supports many more algorithms now, but that was the classic Unix way of making a password hash. Now, why did they do it this way? You notice that they used the password to encrypt a known value. Why not do it the opposite way? Why not just encrypt the password? The problem with this is, where does the key have to be stored? And by the way, that suggestion that what I was talking about just a second ago, I pulled that out of that Morse, I think what was it, Morse and Thompson article from like 78. But people, even though it was published in 78, a lot of people ended up not following it. A major premise of this entire talk is that if people had read that one article, a lot of password mistakes over the last close to 40 years would not have been made. The problem if they just encrypted the password and saved it in a file would be the key has to be stored someplace. So where do you securely store that key? The scheme of taking a known value and encrypting it with the password instead apparently came out of time-sharing computer systems by M.V. Wilkes in 1968. So that concept's been around for quite a while. So basically making a hash of it. But not everybody took this advice. Even though this concept has been around for a long time, some people do simply encrypt the password and store it someplace. But that causes all sorts of problems. If you're always using the same password, you can do known plain text graphical attacks, or you can just go looking for where they store the password, or you can look in the source code. To give you three quick examples of where this is coming back to bite people is GPP password, syskey, and VNC. So to remind you about how all those working, this is why just encrypting with a known password is bad. In VNC, at least VNC a few years ago, there's so many different implementations of VNC now. Surely one of them does not have this issue, and probably a few of them still do. Other ones may have fixed it by now. But at one time, what you could do, is go into the registry or go into the config file on a Unix-like system and essentially pull out the password hash, and it was always desencrypted with that certain key that you see right here across the board. So if you could get any kind of physical access to the system, you instantly had the password, and that was the same for every implementation of VNC at one time. Like I said, I'm pretty sure some people have fixed that. My examples here was from Ultra VNC, but I took these samples quite a few years back, so hopefully they don't do it that same way now. But that's an example of why just encrypting passwords is bad. GPP, gather group policy preferences, group policy preferences passwords. This is something that Microsoft put out there to facilitate being able to set passwords on workstations and such. And when you set the password that you want all these workstations to have, you actually do encrypt that password and put it out there in a GPO. The problem is Microsoft published the key for that. Now since everybody knows the key, the first thing a pen tester does if it gets any kind of access to the domain, it just has to be a basic user. They can go out there, grab the files off of the sys volume, and then since they know the key, unencrypt that particular password. Now they know the local admin password for a whole bunch of machines. Once you know the local admin password for a whole bunch of machines, you just start connecting to every single one of those using, let's say, PowerShell exec. Then you see if there's any admins logged in any place using Mimicat and dump the admin's password, and then you can attack more machines and so on and so forth, and it just keeps going. There's also the tools out there for doing this. Metasploit has a module for harvesting these underneath its post-exploitation section for gathering. And PowerShell PowerSploit, you can use git GPP password to do much the same thing. There's also more manual ways. Like, let's say you only have a Unix box of some kind there, Linux box, let's say, on the network. You can use SMB client, connect, grab everything from the sys volume, recurse through everything. Recurse, prompt off, mget policies, exit. That's all the commands that actually grab all the files off of that particular sys volume. Then you can grep for C password. And then after you got that, you can use the GPP decrypt utility to actually decrypt what you find. Now, what is a hash? I mentioned a hash. So, a hash is essentially applying a mathematical formula to a string to get a shorter number or string. Desired properties of a cryptographic hash are so forth. One, is pre-image resistance. This is a one-way function. Basically, if you have a hash, you don't want it to be reversed. I guess you could say, just you go by the definition, apply a mathematical formula to a string to get a shorter number of string. Well, it wouldn't be a shorter number of string. It'd be the same length. If you did a base, let's just say you did a ROT 13 on it, but it's quickly reversible, so it definitely wouldn't fit pre-image resistance. But the idea is, given a hash, you can't easily reverse it to what was put in to get that hash. For instance, I guess a really bad hashing function would be just cut in half whatever it was that was inputted as input. Second pre-image resistance is the next thing you want in a cryptographic hash function. With any given input, it should be hard to find a different input that hashes to the same value. And so basically, you don't want to be a collision. You don't want it to be easy for someone to find something else that goes to the same value. This is a big problem with something like CRC32, which we'll talk about in a second. Then there's other things like collision resistance. It should be hard to find two different strings that hash to the same thing. In this case, you're allowed to choose both inputs. That's what differs it from like second pre-image resistance, where you're only able to choose one of the given inputs. And to give you an example of, example where you have two inputs chosen and where you might have a collision issue. Let's say, have you heard of the birthday attack in cryptography? Basically, you may think that it's very unlikely for any two of you to have the same birthday in here. And if you only choose one person, like, say, Brandon, does anybody else in the room have his same birthday? Yes, that is probably unlikely. However, if you say any two of you with any of the same birthdays, that gets a lot more likely because you don't just compare just one person to everybody in the room. You compare every possible combination of pairing off two people to each other, and it makes it much more likely you're going to find a collision. That brings me to VMS on a VAX system. This is what the early hashing system was. This came out in 1978, and they used the relatively audio-dense 2 CRC32 for creating a password hash. The problem with this is it's really easy to make collisions. The cyclic redundancy checks, while they're quick to do, and they're pretty good for, let's say, transmissions. Like, let's say you're doing something on a line, you want to know whether that noise caused the problem. They're probably really good at detecting that. There's better stuff, but this is a decent job of that. However, if someone is being malicious and deliberately trying to modify data, CRC32 is not that great. So to give you an example, let's say this is the password hash that someone was using. Well, they may have had penetration as the password, but both penetration and perpetuity both hash to the same thing. So it's a quick and easy collision. So that was the reason why VAX wasn't so great. The authentication algorithm would not care which password you entered as long as the hash was right. Because remember what it's doing is you're entering the password, it's making a hash, then it's comparing that hash to a table and say, oh, it's the right hash? Then you must have the right password. So it was easy to generate collisions. With version 2 in 1980, they began using the Purdy polynomial-based algorithm, which was apparently much more secure, but I haven't found a whole much on it. That said, remember my thesis that people keep repeating the same mistakes from, back in the day? They found out this problem in 1980, but when Microsoft implemented their particular CRC32 algorithm for storing passwords for Outlook PST files, they used CRC32. There is actually a tool from Nearsoft that you can use to try to crack password-protected PST files, and it doesn't actually give you the password the person put in. It just gives you other potential passwords that should work just as well, because it's really easy to make collisions. To give you examples of some other hashes, you can see some MD2, MD4, so on and so forth. There's a ton of different ways that people store a password. In this case, I took the password bad pass and ran it through all the different hashing algorithms to give you an idea of what you're looking for. Now, different improvements can be made to hashing algorithms and have been over time. One is slower algorithms. Remember how I mentioned that the classic Unix way of storing a password, they did it 25 times. Newer systems, they do it a lot more and they use better hashing algorithms. I believe the SHA-512 version of Crypt uses it 5,000 times by default. So more iterations, slower algorithms. Over time, people found faster and faster ways to implement DES, and you do it in hardware, it became much, much faster. So slower algorithms became useful. Also, of course, salting it. And, and the point of salting, back in the old days, they had a 12-bit random number tacked on to increase the search space by 4,096 times. Now that you have 128-bit, that's increased more. The reason we salt it is, let's say both Ben and I have the same password. If it always hashes to the same thing, what someone might do is take a huge database of passwords, hash them all pre-computationally so they have them on storage, and then, okay, now I can do this much faster. I don't have to go through the process of hashing it each time. I can just compare the password to that entire list. And they would get both mine and Ben's, no problem. And the storage size for, let's say, turning all of RockU into a password hash list so you can do faster searches isn't that much. However, with the hash, let's say even a 12-bit hash, they increased that storage and the search space by 4,096 times, which makes it much more unfeasible. This is one of the reasons why you don't see, I don't know, I actually might be able to see them, but rainbow tables came out for LM hashes and NTLM hashes, but not various Unix types, because Unix types have been using salts. And it'd be infeasible usually to make a big rainbow table of them. And even though this whole concept had been come up with why you need to salt things back in 1978 at least, when Microsoft was designing some of their systems from 85 to, let's say, 91, they didn't think to salt the passwords, which makes a lot of the attacks we do today as easy as they are. We'll talk more about them in a bit, though. These are parts of a modern password hash. The part in blue is the hash type, so you know what algorithm it is. In this case, it's a SHA-512 algorithm. The green is the salt that's going to be used with the algorithm to make sure if we both have the same password, it's not always going to come out to the same thing. And the red part is the resulting hash of the password with the given salt. And you see there's a whole bunch of different algorithms, but most modern systems I've seen, at least as far as Linux is concerned, seems to be SHA-512. I list some other common ones for different Unix variants in the article. Now, Microsoft, did they listen? Or I should say Microsoft, IBM, and Freecom, because when a lot of this stuff was coming about, they were the ones designing it. Because essentially, I don't know if they ever read that paper, Password Security, a Case History, because when they were designing LAN Manager, basically those three companies' solution to Novell NetWare, they didn't think to salt the hash. So they created LAN Manager. And LAN Manager is pretty bad. And I'm trying to find the very first implementation of LAN Manager. For instance, I know OS2 started coming out around that time. I don't think they used the same algorithm in OS2, but I don't know, and I can't find good docs. As far as I know, the LAN Manager algorithm probably came out when LAN Manager did, which I think, I'm trying to remember if that was 90 or 91. I'm pretty sure I have it in the article. They also came up with a different way of storing it, NTLM in 93. But first we'll talk about LAN Manager. And LAN Manager was, because of legacy things, LAN Manager was also implemented not only in LAN Manager itself, but in later versions of Windows for authentication purposes. And it was used in older Windows operating systems. At one point, you couldn't actually use NTLM on various DOS-based versions of Windows. They released a patch for that later on that you could, or a service pack you could do it with. But the way LM hashes work, and the reason they're so bad, what happens is they convert the password to all uppercase. So there you're already reducing the search space that you have to go through, because you don't have to worry about both upper and lower. They pad the plain text with null characters to make it 14 bytes long if it's not already 14 bytes long. They then split into two 7-character byte chunks. Now, a huge problem with this is, cryptographically speaking, it's much easier to crack one, well, I should say numerically speaking, it's much easier to crack two 7-character passwords than one 14-character password. So that causes problems. But the reason they did that was to get that 56-bit key for doing a DES encryption. And they basically used those characters to generate a key. It's not like a straight ASCII bit for bit. I can't remember exactly how they do it. They stretch it a little bit. I can't remember exactly how they write it. I've seen the algorithm written in before, but it's not like it's just, this is the ASCII number, that's what we're using as the key. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But they use it to derive the key, and they desencrypt this particular value and store that as the hash for LM hashes after concatenating them back together. But there's no salt used at all. And then that's stored in the SAM file. NT NTLM is a little different. You take the Unicode mixed case password and use the message digest 4 algorithm to obtain the hash. Now, what MD4 is not great, it's still better than what they were doing with the LM hashes, and at least since it's Unicode, you have potential for more characters. So you don't have to worry about the lowercase issue, or sorry, all uppercase issue of LM. Also, they didn't store the password in the hash, sorry, the hash in the SAM file as before. So that's the problem with those two types of passwords, hashes, and if they'd read the paper from 78, they would have known not to do that. So reinventing the wheel. Now password cracking really starts taking off in the 90s, but there are precursors to this. And I kind of give credit to this, to the concept of Wright's Law. Now Wright's Law is named after Joshua Wright, and essentially it's stated this way. Security will not get better until tools for practical exploration of the attack surface are made available. So until tools are around to do certain kind of attacks, no one's going to try. If it's not cheap enough to do, there's also, for instance, there's all sorts of wireless attacks that people are researching now that have been around for a long time, potentially, but no one had the tools to actually try them until people could do software-defined radio like HackRF, or, for instance, Bluetooth. There's a lot of Bluetooth insecurities that have been around for a long time, but no one had the tools to explore them until Ubertooth was invented and people could afford to actually do that. If you want to talk about some of the password problems, until a lot of people had home PCs to experiment with for themselves, they really didn't have the tools to play around with this. Oh, not to be confused with another Wright's Law, which is unrelated to what I'm talking about right here. At least not directly. All right. As password cracking kind of moved along, I said it mostly took off in the 90s, but there are precursors to that. For instance, the Morse worm. Remember Robert Morse, the guy whose article I keep talking about? He had a son, Robert Tappan Morse, who was a chip off the old cipher box. What he did was he invented a worm because he wanted to experiment with network connectivity and playing around. So he created this worm that, amongst other ways of spreading, would actually try to crack crypt-encoded passwords on Unix boxes and then use them to spread to other boxes around the network. And it got quite successful in 1988 and started passing itself around. But that would be an example of a password cracker actually built into malware to help itself spread. But the earliest instance of, some kind of organized password cracking for the sake of fun of doing it, there was actually a contest that must have took place in 82, because there was a Usenet post from 83 where someone was announcing the second official Unix password cracker contest. So these people were organizing a password contest to see who could crack the most passwords the fastest. But it really didn't take off, I said, I don't think until closer to the 90s. One of the earliest password cracking tools that you'd find that was like general use, something that you could easily just go out and get, something that wasn't like homebrew or anything like that, or passed amongst people, was probably Computer Oracle and Password System, part of COPS by Dan Farmer. It included a tool called PWC for cracking those classic Unix passwords. That came out in 89. Sort of based on it, Alex Marford started work on Crack, and he worked on it for quite a while, but he didn't actually make a public release of it until Crack 2.7a. And it was originally based on PWC, but it was a complete rewrite as of 2.0, and that came out on July 15th of 1991. It had a few new features that weren't around before, like a programmable dictionary generator, so you could like do mangling of words and such. Also, it had the ability to do network distributed password cracking, so you can say, okay, this computer run through all these combinations, this computer run through all these combinations, and so forth. Then Crackerjack came for DOS and OS2 by Jackal. So this opened up the fun to more people who didn't have necessarily Unix boxes. Let's say you only had a shell someplace. You could still get to the password file and get its hashes because they weren't using shadow files, perhaps. Grab all those, take them to your home machine, and start doing the cracking. Not that that would necessarily be more powerful, but it's yours and you control it. Then finally, well, not finally, I got a lot more coming, but John the Ripper by Solo Designer came about, and this is still in wide use today. Now, the first version that was released was a DOS version, but the code is very portable. I believe he was using Cygwin, and it's been ported to many platforms since. Originally, it was also just for Unix passwords, but it's now being used, now has so many different algorithms, especially if you install the Jumbo Pack. I don't know much of any kind of password hash that they don't have implemented in it. Someone can surely find one, but it has a wide breadth of field when it comes to what password hashes it can crack. And it even has neat features where you throw it at a password file, it'll look at it and automatically know what kind of password it is based on what's there. Eventually, shadow file became more and more popular. Now, shadow file, it basically moves the hashes out of something that's readable by everybody to a file that you have to have root privileges to be able to get to. Now, the first implementation of shadow file that I know of was System 5 Release 3.2 in 1988, but didn't really seem to take off immediately. Someone here said mid-90s. I'm pretty sure I noticed some systems in the late 90s that still weren't using shadow files, but it started to take off over time, and I think one of the reasons it started taking off over time, someone on Twitter told me basically it's because of Unix standardization projects. I have a pet theory that maybe part of it was there was so many password crackers coming out at that point, and so many people had home PCs powerful enough to do password cracking, that it was like, oh, okay, maybe we should implement shadow files for all these people at universities and such that have shell accounts. Might be a good idea. Windows cracking software, it took off a little bit later. Jeremy Allison released the first version of PW Dump on March 24th, 97. But he just had something you could dump out the password hashes. You wouldn't necessarily be able to crack with that. However, NT Crack by Jonathan Wilkins was announced on news groups in March 28th, 1997, not too long after that. And what it did would it allows you to crack those LM hashes I was talking about before that are so weak. Now, let's say you didn't have LM hashes. At the time, you probably had LM hashes. But if you want to do either one, LoftCrack came out shortly thereafter in April 11, 1997, and was the go-to password cracker for Windows for a long time. I remember Hacking Exposed. I think the first version of that book came out in like 1999. Even into the mid-2000s, they kept recommending and talking about LoftCrack when there had been a lot of other stuff that had come out better since. But that really opened up the way for people doing password cracking on Windows. Well, Microsoft noticed all this, and they issued Windows NT for Service Pack 3, and this introduced syskey. And this was May of 15th of 1997. And what it did was it added an extra layer of encryption on those SAM files where the password hashes were stored, so you couldn't just dump it out directly with PW Dump. Sort of. PW Dump was later modified that if you had root privileges, you could still dump them out because you could still get the syskey. And that goes back to one of the things I mentioned earlier. Syskey is still stored in the system, inside the system hive. Remember how I mentioned just encrypting a password doesn't necessarily do you a whole lot of good if you don't have a good place to put the key? They didn't have a good place to put the key, so essentially all they did was add one extra step to cracking those passwords. So now in a modern system, if I have physical access, boot from a boot CD, get the SAM in the system file, get the syskey out of the system file, and then crack the SAM file. So basically you'd have to grab, and I know this path is most often the path, it could be something other than C drive, it could be a different path, but this is where you most of the time would find the SAM and system file. And then you can get that easily by either pulling the drive, using a boot CD, or rely on weak permissions. If you were to do it all from a Kali Linux CD or DVD, you'd boot from that. You'd essentially change into your media into wherever that particular config folder is, so you'll be at the same place where the SAM and system are. You'd use BK Hive to dump the dump the syskey out of the system hive. Then you can use SAM dump to actually dump out all the password hashes. Then you can use John to crack those hashes. I recommend using the RockU database. And this is essentially all the commands I usually go through if I'm on a fresh install of Kali Linux to get everything I need to sit there and boot from boot DVD and then just crack the passwords. Also, you can just copy the SAM system, and Kane has the ability to pull the syskey out of a system file and crack a SAM. If you're looking to do this on a domain, you want to look for the ntds.dit file. You could also use Meterpreter and basically run a smart hash dump and hope for the best. There's also ways of using volume shadow copy if the machine's up and running to actually make a copy of that ntds.dit file, so you can make a copy and then from that copy be able to extract the hashes. And that's a few Python commands for actually extracting. And we're not going to go into all this. I just have it in here as notes for people that might want to try it later on. And there's John and me using the RockU database or list of passwords to be able to crack. But NT passwords and LM passwords, password hashes, and NT password hashes weren't the only kind of password problems that Microsoft experienced back in the day. Another problem they had was with PWL files. These were used in the older DOS-based version of Windows. So let's say Windows 95, Windows 98. And the first version apparently only used the 32-bit RC4 algorithm for encrypting everything. But, you know, that was kind of weak in of itself. The file's name is also based on the username, so you know whose passwords you're trying to crack. And they would store, by the way, this PWL file was used for like storing network passwords, so you wouldn't have to enter them every time. But the problem was that you could do a known plaintext attack on these PWL files because the first 20 bytes are not random. It's based on the uppercase username and with some null characters added. And if you know what that is and you're using something like a stream cipher, which is what RC4 is, you can quickly find out at least part of that key stream and be able to start decrypting the other first 20 bytes of other lines in that particular file. So this makes it easy to find out the cipher stream. You just have to do a little XOR operation. And they use this RC4 algorithm over and over again on multiple entries in this particular PWL file. So since you knew part of one of them, you could find the results in the other sections as well. To give you a better idea on how this works, and this is not using RC4, this is just using a simple XOR and assuming I made binary data out of the text. But it's easier to illustrate than using RC4. Let's say my text is this particular binary string, and that's what it is in, let's say, an 8-bit ASCII representation. This is what my password is. Let's say I wanted to encrypt it, test, and pass. If I did an XOR, so every time there is 2 zeros, I get out of 0. Anytime there's 2 ones, I get out of 0. And anytime there's only 1 1, I get out of 1. What ends up happening is it's like a bit mask. And so when I go through all those operations, I get this particular encrypted text. However, if it's a known plain text, what I can do is I can XOR the ciphertext with the clear text that I know is there and basically get out the original key. And that's one of the big problems with PWL files. Oh, as far as other password storage on Windows, there's also domain stored cache credentials. Now this algorithm's changed over time. It's stored in the registry. Basically, by default, most Windows systems are going to store the last 10 sets of logins. So let's say the domain controller is down or your network's down, you can still log into the workstation with your domain credentials. They just happen to be cached local on the machine. They did this better than they did NTLM hashes and LM hashes at least. Now the original version of the MS cache algorithm is essentially that they'd take a string to lower of your username and use it as a hash. It's not a great hash. It's not a hash with a lot of entropy, and it's your knowable hash, but it's better than nothing at all. And they would then take the MD4 of the Unicode password, so basically your normal NTLM password, concatenate those together, and then MD4 all that again. Now they changed that algorithm in Vista, and now it's much more complicated. They take the original DCC1 style password hash, and they then use the PBKDF2 hash function to use it, and a bunch of algorithms I don't necessarily understand. They do it like 10,240 times, then truncate it to 128 bits, and then use that and store it, which became computationally a lot harder to crack. And I started using that, I believe, in Vista. Now, sort of related to all this is Sniffers. You ever wonder why there's so many so many plain text protocols out there? Why didn't anybody think to stop this before? Well, if you think about it, when were some of these protocols invented? Telnet came out originally in 1969. FTP was invented in 1971. And back then, most of these networks were small and trusted, and people weren't necessarily thinking about, live looking at the wire and seeing what's passing. And back in the day, this I think it was like in the late mid-80s, when a network card cost $650. Not many people necessarily had them. This goes back to that Wright's Law. Until people have something to experiment with, people aren't going to develop the tools necessary to actually test the security of it. Because, for instance, I want to do some research on some of these these electronic locks that are out there. But just for doing simple research, I have a hard time willing to spend $250 on just a door lock I'm never going to use again. Actually, I'm kind of thinking about doing it. Just having my lockpick village. It'd be kind of neat. But this all changed when people started having tools to play with things. So in 1987, TCP dump was invented. So that put the ability to start doing some network sniffing in everybody's hands. And so things like SSH were invented so that you didn't have to use Telnet or other insecure terminal protocols. And that came about in 1995. Over time, people started developing better sniffers for certain tasks, like dsniff. TCP dump itself, you could watch what was going on and say, okay, I know that's the Unix password based on what's around it. Things like dsniff would actually look at the protocol and just give you just the parts you want, like just the usernames and just the passwords. EtherCap in 2001 added even more features. I don't know about more, but as far as being both a sniffer and an ARP poisoner and having some other utilities built in, I think EtherCap has a few more things going for it than dsniff. Dsniff, I believe, it came with ARP spoof, so you could use that for ARP poisoning and redirect traffic through you. Which tool you use? I usually use dsniff just for simplicity on a lot of things, if I just want to prove a point. But yeah, purpose-built sniffers like those for security came out. Despite that they knew about people using sniffers for quite a while, when the HTTP basic algorithm was being invented, I'm assuming sometime in the mid to early 90s, they went incredibly simplistic with it. They took the username and the password, and instead of doing any kind of actual encryption on it, they basically just base64 encoded it. But since it's base64 encoded, you just quickly reverse that without any issues. Now, they did come up with Message Digest a little bit later on, which was more secure. That actually did do a challenge response system. Also, another event that was happening in the late 90s to mid-2000s, MD5 became really popular for web applications because people were developing a lot of web applications in PHP. PHP is a very easy programming language to learn. It's pretty powerful as far as you can get someone's library to do something, someone else has already written it. It's very user-friendly, but also allows the user to do what they want, and quite often what the user wants to do is a mistake. I was making a project many years ago, German Dream's taken over since, but Mutilidae, which was a deliberately vulnerable PHP application. And that was incredibly easy to write the first version of. Because writing an insecure PHP application, yeah, my understanding of some development environments, like let's say ASP.NET, you have to work at it a little bit because it kind of shoestrings you into making you not do stupid things. Not that people don't still, but PHP, you said you want to do something, it'll let you do it. But MD5 became popular because PHP crypt function was not platform portable. It didn't always work on the same on all platforms. Maybe like Windows and Linux, it would be different. MD5, however, was. Also, there was US export restrictions still on DES-based crypt3, so people started using MD5. The worst thing about how to use MD5, though, wasn't so much they were using MD5, was that they were using no salt on it. Just a simple MD5. So you could make a big old table of pre-computed password hashes and quickly check, oh, is that password hash in here? Yes, it is. One of the things I would do, and I don't recommend doing this on an actual professional pen test because you really don't want to be sending your client's password hashes out on the internet, but sometimes you'll find a password hash, just do a Google search for it. And someone someplace may have cracked it already, and it'll come up for you. I only recommend doing that for a fun lab environment, though. Also, more ways to create MD5 collisions have been found, though this is probably not that relevant to password cracking, because being able to create, unlike a CRC32, where you have a very short string, you can get that will generate that CRC32. Making a usable collision that you could use for logging in is probably not so likely. But people have found ways of doing MD5 collisions over the intervening years. Now, if you're on more modern systems, you may want to use the public domain PHP pass framework, or in PHP 5.5 plus, the password hash function instead of using something like MD5. Another thing that really became popular in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, was time memory trade-offs. I kept talking about rainbow tables. Rainbow tables is essentially a more efficient way of storing password hash lookups than just a flat text file. And some of the ideas behind setting these up was originally proposed by Martin Hellman in 1980, but Philippe Ocean wrote a paper in 2003 named "Making a Faster analytic time-memory trade-off, which populates the use of rainbow tables. He invented off-crack, and off-crack was designed to show off this faster time-memory trade-off technique. And remember how LM hashes and NTLM hashes aren't salted? That means they're fairly easy to store because you don't have to store, thousands and thousands of different versions of the same thing for a different hash. So it became possible to make a database of all these, a rainbow table of all these different passwords and quickly be able to look them up. Oh, if you ever know how something is hashed, sometimes you can just do a Google search for that particular password and then find it out there someplace. Or you could find the app. If you know where it stores the password based on watching where it writes to the disk, you can use the password, and then search for that hash on the internet, try to figure out how it's being hashed. If you ever get to the source code, you can try to figure out how it's hashed. If you're good of a debugger, you can figure out how it's hashed. That slide was probably something I left in from an earlier talk that was more about actually hands-on cracking and not so much about some of the history. Another thing that became popular in the 2000s, but was known about back in the 90s a little bit, was the idea of passing the hash and similar tools. A simple challenge response system requires a secret shared by client and server. And in this case, they're not actually using your password as a shared secret as much as they're using your hash as a shared secret. Back in 1997, someone had a bug track ID 233, and they basically discovered that how this works, if you had the hash, you could use that to authenticate without having to have the password necessarily. And Paul Ashton made that post to NT Bug Track, and he also made a modified Samba client where you essentially take a hash and input it as how you're going to authenticate. So instead of using the password, you use the hash, because that's what the challenge response system was actually using. Later on, Jomo Kuhn released a Samba, spelling issue, patch for PTH, for pass the hash in 2003. Support for Metasploit wasn't added until like 2007 by Kurt Grutschmacher. I love some of these names. Grutschmacher? And so basically, now if you just had the password hash, you compromise one box, you dump the hashes, you can now use that password hash without ever cracking it to start attacking other boxes on the network. MSVCTL by Johannes Grumbel came out in 2007 to allow you to do similar things. And the pass the hash toolkit by Herman Ocho in 2007. So even though this has been known about since like about 97, it didn't seem that the tool really took off until later on. Actually, I think Jomo Kuhn, that's one of your guys, isn't it? Joe Monlock? Oh, Joe Monlock. Yeah, he was one of the first people to actually implement something that some pen testers were actually beginning to use. But even though it was known about then, and then people started working with it in 2007, you didn't really see it take off until, people knew about it and using it a little bit in 2003. You didn't really see it take off until 2007. Basically, the way pass the hash works, let's say when you're authenticating, and you're negotiating something, you negotiate what authentication protocol you're going to use. And those LM challenge response, NTLM version 1 challenge response, NTLM version 2. This isn't like you're using Kerberos. This is only used in certain circumstances, like let's say direct IP to IP communications as opposed to going via the host name. But if it's like two machines in the same domain, if it's one IP being used as the naming convention to another IP, it falls back to like NTLM. But let's say the two boxes negotiate how they want to do the authentication. Once it's agreed on, a challenge is sent to the client. Using a shared secret that both the client and server knows, a mathematical process is used on that nonce, that challenge, and then sent back. If they both compute the same response, the server is obviously going to think, okay, he must know the password. But in reality, the shared secret actually was the hash. So if you have the hash on this system, and it matches the hash for the same account on this system, you'll get in. And let's say these systems is not necessarily a server and a client. Let's say they're both workstations. More than likely, people have imaged the systems, and they haven't bothered to make unique local administrator passwords. So you get the local administrator password on one box and start scanning the network, you're going to find another box that's using the exact same password hash. And you never have to crack the hash, but you can still compromise those other boxes. So the way that works is you crack one box, You scan for every box where that username with that particular password hash lets you in. You keep looking for, where if you're a local admin, you start installing things like Sniffers or keystroke loggers, or you just look for some machine out there where an admin is logged in, a domain admin. Then you take their credentials, and you just repeat ad nauseum. I was also doing past hash tools, as I mentioned before. It's now built into Metasploit and Interpreter. There's also Windows credential editor, which I use from time to time. If I want to basically not join a Windows box to the domain, but want to become a particular domain user, I use Windows credential editor, the -G option, and the password. That will give me back out the password hash I want to use. Now, if I'm just stole the password hash from the local account, the local SAM file, I wouldn't be doing that part. And then I can just say who I want to impersonate by using username, domain, and then that particular password hash. There actually was one time we used this. It was really useful. Someone had, we had the hash, but we couldn't directly input it. So we used this password generator, because the hash they had was, it originally had, a yen symbol, yes. And that totally messed with us. And so we ended up actually having to generate the hash to use it instead. We had let me get that right. We had the password, but we couldn't enter it easily, so we ended up generating the hash so we could. And then as the 2000s went on, late 2000s, Mimicats came about, and this problem has to exist for a while, but people really didn't start looking into it till later on. Apparently, the plaintext passwords are stored in the LSAS process's memory to facilitate a WDigest and SSP authentication for users that are currently logged onto the system. Benjamin Delph, also known as GentleWiki, he wrote Mimikatz in 2007 so he could experiment with Windows authentication. And this allows you to, let's say, if you get system privileges on a Windows box, actually dump the plaintext passwords out of memory. And then you can just use those passwords wherever you want. My understanding is they have fixed this in Windows 10, according to what Ben was telling me last night. But Windows, everything else, Windows XP, Windows 2007, Vista, and so forth, up to 8 even, you can still do it. Also, what became popular in the later parts of the early 2000s. How do you even say that? What do you call those? The Audis? The later part of the Audis? Yeah, GPUs cracking became popular. Now, GPUs are less versatile than CPUs, but they are really good at doing a lot of things in parallel because of how they're used to process graphics. Back in 2007, Elcomsoft probably made one of the first GPU cracking software projects, and they were able to use the GPU for actually cracking the passwords. Eventually, things like OCL Hashcat and CUDA Hashcat came out in around 2010. And actually, that was used by Martin's team at DEF CON, I think. The DEF CON that was happening in 2011, I think, to great success. May have been the 2010 team. I'm trying to remember. I have it in the article. Eventually, also John the Ripper, with version 1.7.9, with Jumbo Patch 6, added support for doing GPU cracking. And by the way, this is the GPU cracker that TrustedSec had built a couple years ago. Now, I want to keep expanding that article I mentioned, and I'm not sure what I would add to it. A few things I might think about adding to it as people add new features out there are honeywords and honey tokens. The idea behind a honeyword is essentially you put out a password and you make sure it gets sort of like a honeypot. You make sure if it gets leaked, you know if anybody ever used it. So you might have an account that's called admin, but it's not necessarily really an admin, and anybody ever uses that particular password any place, you know someone's compromised something and to look out. A more advanced version of this would be Aerostats passwords. This is something some guys came up with at Purdue, including Spath. The way it works essentially is you have a password system that is apparently completely functional, and the passwords it stores look like real passwords. However, when they crack those passwords, it comes up with a wrong password that if they ever use that wrong password, you know the system's been compromised. You'd have to read the whole paper for a better description of that. There's also a text version of this presentation out there on the TrustedSec website. It was my May 2015 blog post. It has a lot more details and a lot more things than I can easily remember for a quick speech. But that's pretty much it. Quick announcement. DerbyCon's coming up last weekend of September. I don't know why I have this as an announcement since we've always sold out. But if you watch on Twitter, you might be able to find tickets. Also, a bunch of other conferences I go to, but I really need to modify this because a few of these haven't been happening. For instance, this one is now Secure West Virginia. HackerCon is now Secure West Virginia. SkyDogCon is still happening this year, but I'm not sure the exact dates yet. Freaknik, I used to always have fun at. I haven't been in a couple of years, though. And Nauticon, my understanding, will be coming back from next year. And finally, are there any questions? And I think I hit my time just about slightly over. Any questions? I know there was a lot of me spilling out of stuff. By the way, if anybody knows any cool historical anecdotes about password hash storage or where things got screwed up, like, for instance, the story about the guy who walked in to the MIT system and just gave him a punch card and came off with a bunch of passwords, let me know, because I really want to find more incidents like that. Well, there's no questions, then I guess we'll get... What? Was that? Right there? All right.